The first clearly attested occurrence of the name Israel outside the biblical text is to be found on the stele of Pharaoh Meneptah, which can be dated between 1210 to 1205 BCE. You can pause and then read it for yourself. This granite stele tells of the victories of the king of Egypt in a campaign in the Levant. My focus here, part of the text reads, Israel is destroyed. Its seed is no longer. Israel is destroyed. Its seed is no longer. The name Israel on the stele is given a determinative consisting of a man and woman, then 3 vertical strokes indicating that it is plural. Now, this does not mean that it is a group of nomads, but rather it is the name of a definite group rather than of a region or locality. This is important. Let's look at the inscription again. Our focus. Israel is destroyed. Its seed is no longer. Syria has become widows for Egypt. This passage is marked by alliterations and the personification of Syria, the land in which Israel is located, as a collection of widows, which is in the plural, in mourning. So here, Israel appears as a man and Syria as a woman. So at different levels, this verse claims that Israel, which is a group, and Syria, which is a country, have collapsed because of Egypt. What should we take Syria to be here? Is it a synonym for Canaan? Or for only a part of Canaan? That's the question again. What should we take Syria to be? The Syria on Meneptah's stele, what should we take it to be? Is it a synonym for Canaan or for only a part of Canaan? The inscription seems to locate Israel between Ashkelon, Giza, Yanaum. If in this geographical enumeration, Ashkelon and Giza designate the extreme south and Yanaum the extreme north, then Israel is located in the mountains of Ephraim, that is, in the region where Saul will found his kingdom. Quite significant. Israel, at any rate, seems to have been a group that was known by name to the Egyptians and was considered by them to be a potential factor of disorder, but also an enemy sufficiently important for it to be necessary that it be quickly defeated. The mention of the name Israel on this stele is no way presuppose an exodus or any kind of emigration of this group from the land of Egypt. That is not what Meneptah's stele, the Israel mentioned there, is talking about at all. One question remains. This group's name indicates that its members worshipped the god El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. But did they also already worship Yahweh? This is where I want to hang my hat. This group's name, Israel, indicates that its members worshipped the god El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. But did they also already worship Yud He Vav He, Yahweh? The worship of a deity like El, which preceded the worship of Yud He Vav He, Yahweh, is partially reflected in the stories of the patriarchs, especially that of Jacob, who, by struggling with God and changing his name, became Israel. This name, El, is used very often in the narrative about the patriarchs in Genesis 12 all the way to Genesis 50. In Genesis 33, we read something interesting. There he erected an altar and he named it El Elohe Israel. God is the God of Israel. El Elohe Israel. According to this chapter in the book of Genesis, Jacob erected an altar for El, God of Israel, near Shechem, apparently to mark out his territory. Now, if any historical recollections from the clans of the era at the end of the second millennium actually lie behind this story about Jacob, then it shows us that these sons of Jacob worshipped one or several of the manifestations of the god El, not Yahweh. The expression El Elohe Israel is founded on an ancient tradition. Now, most of the passages in Genesis and the other biblical books that mention various manifestations of El are to be found in rather recent texts and presuppose that the reader understands El as the equivalent of God, that is, Yahweh, Yud He Vav He. Let me repeat that again. Most of the passages from Genesis and the other biblical books that mention various manifestations of El are to be found in rather recent texts and presuppose that the reader understands El as the equivalent of Yahweh, YHVH. Okay. This does not exclude the possibility that these texts preserve the traces of worship of the great god El. Now, let me say this briefly here about the formation of the Hebrew canon to explain this statement that I have here. There is a very broad scholarly consensus that the Hebrew scriptures took their current form sometime in the 6th century BCE. The library of scrolls and books were reworked to try and present a seamless story presenting the theology of the redactors at that time. The final redaction of the Hebrew scriptures was done on the basis of ideological reasons. It was done to teach monotheism and to endorse the Jerusalem temple and disendorse all the other temples that existed. It was to justify the Davidic monarchy, the Levitical priesthood, the authority of the high priest family, and the authority of the Jerusalem temple. So, when you see YHVH in Genesis, this is the reason why. YHVH has been reworked into the Genesis narrative, even though we know that the patriarchs never encountered, met, or knew YHVH. Let's look at this encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek, and let me make a point further. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to Elyon. And he blessed him, and he said, Blessed be Abraham to Elyon, who possesses heaven and earth, and blessed be Elyon, who has delivered your adversaries into your hand. And he gave him a tithe from all. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the souls and the possessions, take for yourself. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I raise my hand to YHVH, El Elyon, who possesses heaven and earth. What do we have here? Let's summarize it. Abraham here, Genesis 14, has Abraham play a part in a kind of a world war. Genesis 14 is one of the very last sections to be added to the story of this patriarch. Put that in your spirit. The episode of the encounter with Melchizedek is even more recent than the first version of Genesis 14. Put that also in your spirit. The text tells how Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of El Elyon, blesses Abram in the name of El Elyon. Abram then swears an oath by this God. I raise my hand toward YHVH, El Elyon, creator of heaven and of earth. What most don't know, what most haven't been taught, is that this word YHVH here in Abraham's oath is lacking in the Septuagint, in the Syriac manuscripts, and in the Genesis apocryphon found at Qumran. I will repeat it again. Abraham swears an oath. He says, I raise my hand towards YHVH, El Elyon. But this word YHVH is lacking in the Septuagint. In the Syriac manuscripts and in the Genesis apocryphon found at Qumran, it is probable that the original text did not contain the name of YHVH, but rather copyists added it to affirm the identity of YHVH and El. But Genesis 14 clearly shows that El Elyon was originally a god that is distinct from YHVH. They are not the same. Now, commentators have often wondered whether Elyon was really a god who was distinct from El, given that the name is also attested without El. So you have El, you have Elyon, and you have Yahweh. Are they the same? Are these one and the same? Are they three in one? What do the experts tell us? What do the scholars tell us? Professor Emmanuel Tove, in his critical analysis of the biblical Hebrew text, writes that Elyon, El, and Yahweh are not various ways to indicate the God of Israel, but they actually correspond to three different individuals. Elyon is not Yahweh. El is not Elyon and is not Yahweh. Yahweh is not El. Yahweh is not Elyon. In early Israel, Yahweh or YHVH did not belong to the top tier of the pantheon. He belonged to the second tier of the pantheon. He was not a presider god, but one of his sons. What you see now in the biblical text, or what is at work in the biblical text, is not a loss of the second tier of a pantheon headed by YHVH. Instead, what you see is the collapse of the first and second tiers in the early Israelite pantheon, which was likely caused by an identification of El, the head of this pantheon, with YHVH, Yahweh, a member of the second tier. This development would have taken place by the 8th century, since Asherah, having been the consort of El, would have become Yahweh's consort only if these two gods were identified by this time. The importance of the references to El in the stories about the patriarchs and the different attempts to identify El with YHVH preserve memories of the worship of the god El under different forms by the ancestors of Israel. Israel worshipped El before Yahweh. El and Yahweh are not the same. El and Yahweh became the same later on in Israel's history. And then YHVH took over from El according to Israel tradition. This is not the ancient tradition. In the ancient tradition, El was the chief of the gods of Israel. YHVH, coming from the south, becomes part of the council of El. But he's in the second tier, not the first. But as time went on, YHVH became the patron deity of Israel. How did that happen? Stay tuned.